I appreciate you guys coming out. My name's George Hunter, as Carl said, and thanks again for having me. I appreciate it. I've been covering crime for the news, for the Detroit News, for on and off for close to 20 years now. I've been at the paper 21, but I started covering crime in the late 90s. I got taught how to cover the beat by I just was with him last night on the radio, by the great David G. Grant. And first thing he told me is, you can't burn these cops. You know, if they tell you something off the record, it better stay off the record. And I learned that the hard way. Not the hard way, I never burned anybody. But I did learn the hard way that a lot of cops don't trust the media, and it takes a long time to get their trust. And that works both ways too, because if some of my best stories have come from sources said. When you read that, there's a vetting process. Luckily, knock on wood here, that I've never been burned by that, but you have to trust that your source is giving you accurate information. And anybody who's been around any cop shops, as Doug can tell you, a former Dearborn police officer for many years, a lot of rumors go around, and you know, sometimes the information's not accurate. So it's up to me to determine if what's rumor, what's truth, because if you're going with a source said, you better be right, because the one time when you're wrong, your editor is never going to trust you again. So I've done many, many stories, sources said. I've also not done many stories, sources said, because you know, I don't trust that guy, or I'm not sure the information's solid. So you have to maintain that relationship with the police department and the officers, but you also have to sort of have one foot in where it's not an adversarial relationship, but there's times where they're not going to be happy with what you write. So even though I have dear friends that I've met on the department, and I have two of my brothers were former Detroit cops, and my brother was a Detroit cop, my sister was a Detroit cop, and my other brother still is a Wayne County Sheriff Deputy. So I kind of can see things from the police officer's angle, and I know what they go through, you know, having family. So, and I also have some dear friends that I've met, but when it comes to work, you have a relationship, but you can't be too close to them. So it's kind of a weird balance you have to affect. And, you know, newspapering is, you have 2 feet in these different areas too, because we're a money-making venture. I'm not going to lie, we're here to make money. We're a business, but we also have a public trust. You see the same thing with law enforcement, with say county sheriffs and even municipal police and certainly prosecutors. They're beholden to voters. So sometimes the needs of the business end of my business and the public trust, they're kind of opposed, and unfortunately, I'm going to say sometimes the business interests supersede the public. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen sometimes, and that's when you cuss at your editor and they cuss back at you, and you know, that's the fun of the job. And you know, we get accused a lot. You know, you guys sensationalize crime. You sensationalize it. I don't know where they get that idea, that the media sensationalizes crime. That's actually pretty sensational. That's a 1983 case, and it's a great headline. It's one of the most famous headlines ever written, if not the most famous. And it was New York, obviously, and the reporter, they went through all kinds of conniptions to get this headline done. They heard it was a topless bar. So they had to verify that. The copy editor, who was a legend in my business, they had to verify, was it a topless bar? We can't run with this headline until we verify that. So the reporter, she goes to the bar. Bar's locked, it's a crime scene. So now she has to figure out, she's asking people, nobody knows. So she sees a window, but it's really high up. So she gets a few things from the alley to stand on, and she peeks in the window. Sure enough, there's a neon sign in there that says topless. Oh boy, we got it. So this is 1983, the cell phones we didn't have cell phones back then. They had them, but they lasted, I think the battery life was 2 minutes. So she found a phone booth, dialed her editor, and you got this famous headline, you know. So that's that. Everyone chuckled at it, and it sold papers for sure. But there's people involved in these things, and that's the thing. If you're covering crime, that you always have to keep that in mind, because a story can become abstract. It kind of takes on when there's a big crime story, it takes a life of its own. You know, you have the story, which is an abstract thing, and the editors all go crazy because they're not dealing with the people involved. There are people behind these things. This particular case, you had a man, he was obviously mentally disturbed, and he had a beef with the bartender, and so he goes in there and he finds out that one of the patrons had some medical training. So he forces this poor woman to cut the guy's head off, and then he rapes her. So you have this great headline. It's real funny, huh? But if you stop and think of the people involved in this thing, there's nothing funny about it at all. It's a terrible, terrible crime. So yeah, it's a great headline, and yeah, it sold papers. Was it the best way to do that? From the business standpoint, it was the best way to. That's a fantastically written headline, headless body and topless bar. And the editor of the Post, there was a lot of criticism. He said, what should we have said? Decapitated cerebellum in tavern of ill repute. And New York Times was almost that bad. Their headline for the same crime was, owner of bar shot to death, suspect is held. So they didn't get any criticism, and I bet you they sold more papers than the New York Times that day. But like I said, you have to understand that when you talk to victims that sometimes, they're going through a tough time, so you got to filter things. You don't print everything they say. They may be saying things that they're not in their right mind, and you have to understand that. Immediately after a crime, imagine yourself, if you go through, any death in a family is terrible, and that's a life-changing event for a family. Now make it a heinous crime, and that's even worse. Now add on top of it people like me coming and knocking on your door and some of these big crimes, the editors, and I'm going to blame the editors, that's one of their best functions, is they serve as somebody for me to blame. They keep wanting to move the story forward. Hey, what else can you do? Now, I don't mind if there's legitimate news to cover, but it kind of ticks me off as a reporter. There's nothing to cover today. Well, we need to advance the story, is the industry term. Advance the story. Well, if there's nothing to advance, that's where people get mad at us. There's nothing else to say, but we still want to keep it alive because it's a big story, so invent something. Don't invent anything. If there's no news, then print the cake bake contest that day. So then there's the criminals too. So I'm covering a criminal, Bob Bashara, for instance. I covered that case from gavel to, I want to say gavel, but it's not over yet. And during the trial and during the course of the case, we learned a lot of things about Big Master Bob. And he didn't come off as the nicest guy in the world. That's the most polite way I can figure out to say that. But I have to somehow not judge this guy. I have to keep in my mind, as a reporter, that there's a chance this guy might be innocent of all this. Because if I automatically make up my mind and say, okay, Bob Bashara, he's a scumbag and he's guilty, he killed his wife and that's that, somehow that bias is going to filter into my story somehow, and I'm afraid that it will, so I don't go there. I've tried to train myself over the years, despite what my initial reaction and despite what I may really think if you held me under a lie detector test. I try to keep open the possibility that, this guy might be innocent, and then I pour over my story. Are any of my biases, if I do have them, are they in this story? I wish all reporters did that. Unfortunately, they didn't. They don't. And we're giving the public what they want. I'm going to blame the public. People say, oh, you guys are always covering crime. You sensationalize crime. Well, guess what? It's always been an interest to people. Crime has always been something that, from the very beginning, since there's been publications, people want crime, we give it to them. This one's from the 1600s, I believe. Trials and executions. You talk about tough on crime. Poor Ben and Andrew Savage and Thomas Cann, for forgery, they got hanged. And, people want the death penalty. These guys, burglary, they got hanged. It was the most diabolical robbery of John Miller. He must have been an important guy because they hanged them too for that, So since there's been publications, they've focused on crime. In the late 1600s, you had pamphlets in England that were completely dedicated to crime, and then the penny press in England picked it up years later, and then the U.S. adopted the same tradition. The United States really didn't start sensationalizing crime the way we know it until about the 1830s. They realized that there's an appetite for this, and so they started, giving all the shocking details, and sometimes they actually made up the details back then. Some say we still do. The great murder trial, it's exciting and interesting, everybody, And it's a good thing that they had that murder trial to talk about, because it was apparently otherwise a slow news day. The next best thing they had to talk about was refrigerators and ice boxes. And I don't think that was going to sell many newspapers. So I always say, imagine yourself being the one who's being interviewed. Imagine people knocking on your door constantly. And then as a reporter, you start to see the family dynamics emerge sometimes, and people, you get a lot of Blanche Dubois, and this is their moment in the sun. And then there's others who get mad at me, and I try to be as respectful as I can, but hey, I've got to do this job. There's nothing anyone can do about it. People are the papers are going to cover these crimes. The media is going to cover these things. So being that that's the case, how do I best do this? How do I treat people with respect and what they're going through while still trying to get the information? Rule of thumb is the minute a grieving family says, if it's a politician, I'll stay by his or her door. And I have. I camped outside Kwame's house one time all day on a Saturday when he was in the mansion down in South Lake. But when it's a crime victim, they don't want to talk. I'm very sorry to disturb you. Here's my card if you want to call, and then I go. All reporters don't do that. I've seen them. But don't you think, and don't you, if they say they don't want to talk, they don't want to talk. Leave them alone. They're grieving. They don't want to talk to you. Go. And then the criminals themselves sometimes. The talk I gave here in the fall was about the Stephen Grant case, in which he dismembered his wife. It was a very famous case. I wrote a book about it, Limb from Limb. It's on Amazon if you want to order 5 copies for your mom. And Stephen Grant, while his wife was considered missing, he was calling me up all the time. We did a Sunday story while she was still presumed alive called Who is Tara Grant? And it went into her background and all that. So Stephen calls me that Monday. He says, hey, that was a great story. I got a great idea for you. I'm sure, what is it? How about a story like this? Who is Stephen Grant? And then he starts to tell me his life story. He was more concerned about himself and how he was being played in the papers than he was about his supposedly missing wife. So that was one of those cases where I really had a difficult time, and I was talking to the other media as well. We had a tough time taking out of our mind, okay, this guy's guilty, because if anybody acted guilty, if you remember that case, it was Stephen. He had the big eyes. That's what everyone remembers. And when I learned was when he was lying, his eyes would get bigger and bigger and bigger. And when he went to jail, after he got arrested, the inmates would always taunt him at lunch and stuff. Hey, make the Stephen Grant eyes, man. Make the Stephen Grant eyes. So you remember the 1991 case, Joanne Was. It was a Farmington woman. She went down to the fireworks. It was a famous case at the time. And
Elaine Small, too.
What's that?
Elaine Small, too.
Oh, yeah.
Best friend growing up.
Well, Cassandra and Cassandra Rutherford were the 2 girls who beat this woman up, and it became a big issue. Coleman Young got involved and said something to the effect of the woman shouldn't have been down at the fireworks. So it got into all that. It became a big racial issue. Well, the 2 twins got busted, and they went to prison, and I think Cassandra got arrested for a few things after that. I got a call from her last year. You remember me, Cassandra Rutherford. I was involved in the thing. Oh, yeah, absolutely. How you doing? Well, I want to tell my story, she says. There's been so much bad things said about me. I think it's time I get my story out there. And I said, wonderful. Where do we meet? I'd love to talk to you. Well, there's a little matter. How much are you going to pay me? Yeah, well, I'm not going to pay you anything. Okay, well, So, dealing with criminals and it can be sometimes difficult, because I've got to keep in my mind, like I said, that maybe this guy isn't guilty. Detroit, for my money, is the best news town in the country, by far. You can have New York, you can have Chicago, give me Detroit. If you're a crime reporter, this is where you want to be, as long as you're not lazy, because you're going to have a lot to cover. You have to filter out. It's sad. I get calls sometimes from mothers who I've done 2 stories about their child's death, for instance. And we've already done 2, and there's nothing new to advance the story, as the editors would say. But they call me, hey, can you do another story? The killer hasn't been found. How do I tell that mom? Well, sorry, there's 350 murders a year in Detroit, give or take 50 or so, and I have to write about them, and I can't write a 3rd story because my editor doesn't want, and there's no new news peg. This person, that's their kid. That's the most important thing to them. Well, you have to sometimes tell them that I already did 2, 3 stories, and there's one guy, his daughter was killed driving on the 96, And he's convinced her boyfriend did it. I have to tell him every time that I can't put that in the paper. He's not been charged. It certainly sounds like the boyfriend did it and all the information he gives me, but they haven't charged him. I can't say that the boyfriend did it, and I've done 3 or 4 stories for this guy. Hey, they're still looking for the killer. But you can't do more than that because then you can't justify there's just not enough room in the paper, unfortunately. So Detroit's always been the best news town. A lot of well-known crimes here. Jimmy Hoffa, the Purple Gang, the Oakland County child killer, Vincent Chen's beating, that was a big one. The Detroit News payroll getting robbed, which Doug reminded me of. That was your uncle?
That was my Aunt Priscilla's boyfriend, Frank Alice, and Paul Jaworski, the flathead gang.
Okay, yeah. That was, so that was your family that robbed my business. You owe me some money, man. That was, what, 1928? And I think the Free scooped us on that story, too, didn't they? The Free Press scooped. Our payroll offices got robbed, and the Free Press beat us to the story. And I think maybe that might be because we didn't want to make ourselves look stupid for letting our payroll get robbed. But this was a big case here in Detroit that the media went nuts with. Gerry Buckley. He was a popular radio host in the late 20s and the 30s, early 30s. This was 1930 when he was killed. So he was the popular gadfly, the Lou Gordon of his day, if everyone remembers Lou Gordon. And he had a mayor, Charles Bowles, at the time. He had ran on a law and order ticket. He was going to crack down on the bootleggers and all the gambling houses. Detroit was a hotbed of crime during Prohibition. Being most folks here are history buffs, you probably already realize that. Detroit was probably next to Chicago, the center, because we had the bootleggers running from Canada. So that's how the Purple Gang cropped up, thanks to Prohibition. And so this Charles Bowles ran as a law and order. I'm going to crack down. He gets in office and he did the exact opposite. That never happens. Politician runs on one thing and then does the opposite. So he basically tied the hands of his police commissioner. Harold Emmons was his name. Now he wanted to raid these places. He's a cop, you know. He sees all this rampant crime, but the mayor tied his hands. And again, there you get into the situation where you have law enforcement that wants to do one thing, and then you have politicians who want to do another thing. And that's not always, they're not always on the same page, as any cop will tell you. So this Harold Emmons, the commissioner, is just champing at the bit to raid these places. And Gerry Buckley, the radio show guy, is constantly hammering at this guy Coles on his show, or Bowles, Mayor Bowles. You know, why aren't you raiding these places? Why are you allowing these crimes to go on? Well, 1930 Derby Day, Kentucky Derby, the mayor goes on down to Kentucky to watch the race. And the police commissioner says, hot dog, you know, I got a chance here. So he took a bunch of reporters and said, tell me where the gambling places are. Now that's highly unethical for reporters. We're not supposed to help out the cops. We're just supposed to chronicle what they do. Well, the Detroit reporters took the police commissioners to some of the well-known gambling spots and drinking spots because, contrary to popular opinion, not all reporters are teetotalers. Some of them have vomit in their pockets. So, you know, so they took them to the places and he raided them and he shut them down. And the mayor gets back from Kentucky and he's furious. So he fires the police commissioner. And then Gerry Buckley hits the roof on his radio show. He needs to be recalled. We need to recall this mayor. And they did. They had a recall vote thanks to what, you know, Buckley did and his banging his shoe on his radio program. And sure enough, the mayor gets recalled. Well, the same day of the recall, Buckley gets a call from a woman and says, hey, I got a hot story for you. Meet me in the LaSalle Hotel lobby at 1 in the morning. And a lot of our stories that's how we get our stories. Someone calls a tip, and they always want to be hush-hush. They're so dramatic sometimes. I got the next Watergate, you know, okay, next Watergate. You hear that so much. And so he goes to the lobby to meet the woman, and he's reading the paper, he's sitting in the lobby, and 2 men walk in, and they empty their guns on this guy. And there was another guy in the lobby, and he jumped. There was only one other man. He jumps behind a couch, and the men calmly walk away and walk down Woodward. So you have the most popular radio host in Detroit murdered in cold blood in a downtown Detroit hotel right off of Woodward. So as you can imagine, the papers absolutely went crazy. They went crazy with this thing. And this is from the Detroit News. And you can see the newspaper where he was reading, and they even mention it there. You know, that these are the papers that he was reading. And you know, we wouldn't do this now. People complain about the media, and I'm the last guy to defend us. A lot of the criticism is absolutely warranted. but we're not as bad as we used to be. We wouldn't do that. There's a blood-stained chair and and by the way, the cops wouldn't let us on. This is a crime scene. There is no way that we would be allowed into a crime scene, but there you have it. They did it. Now, Buckley's funeral, they said there was between 10 and 100,000 people, there were estimates. And the thing is you never know how many people are at these big crowds, and I'll look at the Free Press guy, say we're covering the Red Wing Parade or whatever. What do you think? 100,000 people? Yeah, 100,000. The joke is if we both say the same thing, then we're not wrong, even if it's right. So, so the funeral was really big. A lot of people came, and it's kind of sad to see that. That's his gravestone, a little nondescript, grass growing over. It's kind of odd that a guy who had that big of an impact on Detroit history kind of has that kind of a humble gravestone. But his efforts weren't in vain, because the cops started cracking down on the crime in Detroit more than they had, and then Prohibition ended, I think the year later or two, was it 31 or 32, and then crime just kind of went down from there. And this is in April of 1902. Gerry Buckley murder is a fairly well-known one. This little crime wave in Detroit was lesser known. I found this, and I grew up in the Cass Corridor, not far from the main library, and I'm a Tiger geek. Detroit Tigers, I love them. So I used to walk down to the library and pour through the microfilms to read about Ty Cobb and Charlie Gehringer, and even before then, in the dark days, before Cobb came, Wahoo Sam Crawford defected from the National League during the wars. I won't go into that. I could talk to you about baseball all day. So while I'm looking for that stuff, I come across stories sometimes, and this is one from 1902. There was actually a little crime wave. There were 3 murders in 1 week in Detroit, and that was big doings. It was national news. 3 murders. In fact, one of the outside papers said the 2 bodies lay side by side in the morgue, as if that was today, 2 bodies in 1 day is nothing, but back then it was a big deal. Now, one of the murders was your run-of-the-mill kind of murder, if there can be such a thing. You had 2 guys in a bar, and the one beat him in a game of craps, and he said, "Go get me a drink." "I'm not getting you a drink." And as we write, words ensued, an argument ensued, and then followed by gunplay. And the guy shot the guy. So that's your run-of-the-mill. But the other 2 were kind of things that could have been made into Lifetime movies. And this one was Carrie McJennett, 22-year-old girl from a well-to-do family. She has a violin teacher, and she falls in love with him, and they begin to have an affair. Now, the violin teacher is married, and he has a family, but he's telling this girl, "I'm going to leave my wife for you." Never heard that one before. And that's something that's interesting. When you go through history, you realize that the behavior is the same. You see the same kind of stuff. And it's the same here. So she's in love with this guy, and he keeps stringing her along. "I'm going to leave my wife. I just have to figure out how to do it." Well, she becomes pregnant, and she comes to him and demands, "Hey, this is it. You have to leave your wife and go with me." So now he's stuck. He figures he needs a way out of this situation. And the way he chooses is to slit the poor girl's throat. And so she's found outside her house, laying on the sidewalk with her throat slit. And surely they do a little investigating. They find out the violin teacher's a suspect. They bring him into the police station, and he doesn't know anything about it. They tell him, "Take your coat off." He does, and it's completely covered in blood. This guy isn't exactly the best criminal in the world. He didn't even think to change his blood-stained shirt. He thought putting a coat on would be fine. So they finally got him. He passes out in the police station. And 3 days later, the Detroit News called it a record in local police history. 3 days after the crime, he waived his right to a trial, so they had him sentenced, and he was in Jackson prison 3 days after the murder happened. Anyone who's dealt in Wayne County can tell you that doesn't happen. It takes 3 days to file a motion in this county, so that probably is a record that'll never get broken. There was another murder that very night, and this one was another prominent Detroiter, a man named George Haywood. He was also found dead outside his home with a bullet in his head and a big hammer wound. And that was another. This could be a Lifetime movie. It turns out they had taken on a boarder named William Jones. And William Jones was having an affair with Mr. Haywood's wife. Again, never heard that one before, right? So they'd go to parties together. It was really scandalous. And some of the language back then, if you look at some of those, they don't come out and say things, but boy, are they, hinting at the debauchery and the idea that the media in the last 20 years just glammed onto the idea that sex sells is a joke, because if you look at some of these old newspapers, that you'll see that's not the case. And so the wife cooperated with police, and she said that he cast a spell over her, this William Jones, and he forced her to go along with his evil, diabolical plan. And Mr. Jones went to prison, and I don't think the wife, she was cooperating, so she got a deal. And people say they don't like, I hear all the time, why don't you cover the good stories? I hear that so much. You only cover bad stuff. Well, I'm the crime reporter. What am I supposed to do, People say, put me in the paper, and my answer is always, you don't want me putting you in the paper because you're either dead or you're going to jail. But I do positive stories once in a while. This was one of my favorite ones. This was one of my favorite stories I've ever done. There was an officer, a man named Al Branch. He owns a Dearborn, like a spy shop where you sell news cameras and things like that. And he took his son, Bryce, 3-year-old kid, took him down to the Riverwalk one sunny day last summer. And they're in a beautiful day, and this cop comes strolling by, Officer Dan Bell. He's he walks the beat on the Riverwalk. And this little kid goes, and he runs and hides behind his dad, and his dad says, well, what's wrong, Bryce? That's the cop, he's going to shoot me. And the dad's like, what are you talking, wait a minute. He says, no, come here. And so he tells his kid, and he brings the officer over, and he says, he introduced, this is an officer, he's a nice man, he's not going to kill you. The kid had heard a lot of the anti-cop rhetoric that's going on around nowadays, and thought that, he's a black kid. He thought, hey, I'm a black guy, and the cops are killing black people. So the dad was, aghast at this, and he introduced the kid to the officer, and the officer and the dad both told me the same story. The officer was in tears. He was bawling his eyes out there that this little boy, he told me, it broke my heart. This little kid thinks I'm going to hurt him. And so he got down on his knees and pledged, I promise I'll never hurt you. And the dad snapped this picture, and he put it on Facebook, and then the cops that I have as Facebook friends started sharing it. It's one of, I'll tell you, social media, it's good for more than cat pictures, because sometimes there's great stories that come out of things you find, and this was one of them. It was absolutely my favorite story. He bought the kid an ice cream, and then I had to call the dad back because I wanted to do my little Edna Buchanan being the legendary crime reporter for the Miami Herald, and she would put those details in her stories that the killer, the victim had 2 movie tickets in his pocket for such and such a movie, and those kind of things make for better stories. So I called the dad back as I'm writing the story. Hey, what kind of ice cream was it that he bought him? It was a vanilla cone. Okay, great. So I put that in, and it was just an absolute feel-good story, and it got 26 comments, which is nothing. You get hundreds of comments on other stories. This story, which is the worst story I ever worked on, which was also last year. So I had one of my favorites, and the absolute worst ever was, we called her the freezer mom, which some people said it was disrespectful, but that's what she became known as. The woman who, obviously, I'm sure you guys all remember, she killed her 2 kids and put them in the freezer. And I've covered some bad stuff. I covered the mom who barbecued her baby. I covered the mom who put her baby in the microwave. And those things are just, and it's funny, some people, you'll get some reader that'll call and say, why is a kid's death any worse than an adult? Really? If you have to ask, then you don't know. Come on. It's because they never got to experience life at all. They never got to do anything, and they were killed. So, of course, it's worse. The reason why this one's the worst one for me is because even with those cases where you have grieving families and you have survivors and things like that, but in this case, it still just gives me a cold chill to think about it, that the 2 surviving kids had to live for a year with this freezer in their living room. It wasn't in the basement, out of sight and out of mind. It was right there. And they had to pretend for a year that everything was fine. I can't even imagine that. And this got hundreds and hundreds of comments versus the positive story that got 26. Now, I'm sure that people like the positive stories, but the facts are they like reading this kind of stuff. They just do. I can't change it. That's how it is. And there's nothing I can do about it. So the point is that being the reality, you just try to handle it with some sort of sensitivity. But, you see stories like this, and you hear people say, oh, what's the world coming to? The crime is worse than ever. And that's absolutely not the case. This has always been the case. You got to hear a thing from the 1800s. Is a English paper, boys killing their mother, and you actually have a depiction of the crime scene and very lurid stuff. People don't realize there are half the number of homicides now by gun than there were in the 1990s. There were double in the 1990s. You wouldn't know that from all you hear. Crime's worse than ever. It's not. It's nowhere near. Cops getting killed. The worst decades for cops getting killed was the 30s and the 70s. Now, there may be reasons for that because of body armor and things like that, but the point is that it's not worse than ever. There's been terrible people since there's been people, and there's been people like me to cover it since there's been publications. So what's this world coming to? The same thing it was back then when kids could kill their mother. I'm sure there's somebody who read this in the 1890s and said, what's the world coming to? It's not as good as it was in the 1870s. You know. Now, one of the biggest crimes in the history of newspapering was this, the Lincoln Assassination. It's probably the most important crime story in history. It has to be because it was so important to get details to the public in this case, because you're not talking about lurid, something you can read and be thrilled by or disgusted by or whatever. We had to get we being the press, we had to get details out to people, because if you just send a wire, there was no telephone. That was 11 years in the future. If you just put out the wire, the telegraph had been invented. So if you put out Lincoln's been shot, well, the Civil War had just ended. Are we under attack? Is the South attacking the North? Or maybe a foreign enemy is seeing that we're bifurcated as a nation and going to come in and take advantage of us while we're in our vulnerable state, while we're trying to get back together after the war? So nobody knew. So it was crucial that we get the details out. And part of the handout that I handed you guys, the second story, the first one's one of the goofy crime stories I found from the Detroit News from 1907 when I was reading up on of course, the Ty Cobb 1907 Tigers, and I saw that, and I said, I gotta print that out, because it's a funny story about, and again, the story's funny. I bet the people who were involved didn't think it was so funny. Some man, you'll read it. And the second one you'll see is the Lincoln Assassination story written by Gobright. Lawrence Gobright was his name. He was an AP reporter. Now, I also say that Lincoln was no friend to the press. Lincoln's been canonized, and rightfully so. He was a great man, a great president, but he was no angel, as any student of history will tell you. He would shut down newspapers if they disagreed with him. He shut down more than 300 newspapers during his presidency and arrested some editors sometimes, which I would say that's not a bad idea. Editors should be arrested every once in a while, just keep them on their toes. Now, the AP reporter, if you look at the story, he buried his lead. It's the worst case of burying the lead in the history of journalism. He talks about, Grant was supposed to come to the Ford's Theater to see our American cousin, but he couldn't make it. But a good time was had by everybody, and blah, 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 and everyone was dressed up real nice. And oh, by the way, this guy, during the performance was interrupted when this dude, jumped on the stage and said, "Sic semper tyrannis," and ran away. And then he mentions, oh yeah, the president was shot. But I'm willing to cut the guy a little slack. It's kind of an interesting story of how this story came to publication. Gobright is sitting in his office in the AP, a couple miles away from the theater. He gets a knock on the door, and it's some guy he didn't know, but he saw the newspaper office, and he says, "Hey, the president's been shot at Ford's Theater." Oh, so he grabs his notebook, and he jumps in the hack with this guy and his wife, and they clop, 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 horseback it, all the way to the Ford's Theater, and he goes in there. Gobright goes in, and it's a madhouse, as you might imagine. And this is before current, modern crime techniques have come. They're not securing the crime scene. There's people everywhere. Somehow, somebody hands this guy the murder weapon, the revolver, the little gut gun that was used by Booth. So he's got the murder weapon in his hand. Now you got a naval officer that's demanding that he give the weapon over to him. And the reporter's like, "No, I got to give this to the police chief. I can't give it to anyone else." So you got people who are clamoring to, "Give me the gun, give me the gun." Nope, he finally finds the police chief. He gives him the gun. He also heard that Secretary Seward had been killed in his sleep. So he asked again. He finds a hack and clop, clop, clop across town to the secretary's house. Sure enough, he determines he was killed too. So he verified that, jumps back in the hack, goes back to his office, bangs out the story on a rudimentary typewriter. I think they had been invented just a few decades prior to that. So he bangs out his story, then he gets it and he wires it to the newspaper, wires it to his customers, the AP subscribers. And the New York Herald at the time, which was the biggest paper in the country, they got this story out by like 2 in the morning. after the murder happened, maybe 4 or 5 hours after the murder. That's still, for my money, the greatest feat in the history of journalism. If you stop and think of all of the things that happened along the way, and then consider that back then they had to manually typeset every character, every comma, every space, every line. I mean, and they got it out. It hit the street, and people were at least had the latest information. And again, I give him slack for burying his lead, because it says in the headline that the president was assassinated. And it's funny, back then, assassination just meant shot. It didn't necessarily mean killed. So I think he was still alive when the first, shot. There's some headlines, mortally wounded, so it's a fantastic feat to get this story out. And then you got some crimes back then, or a few decades later, they're nothing but salacious. This is Lizzie Borden. Boy, they had Lizzie was the precursor to Bob Bashara. You know, just all the lurid details of her life came out, and the papers had what they call a field day. But again, the public wants this stuff, so we're doing nothing but giving people what they want. So don't blame me, blame yourself, you know. And then there are times when the press absolutely crosses the line, and this is probably the most egregious example. In 1928, Ruth Snyder had her husband killed, and she got the chair. You know, they called it the chair in the old movies. And so the New York Daily News, which has never been considered a paragon of journalistic virtue to this day, but the photographer straps on an ankle camera and sneaks in, and he snaps a picture just at the moment of death. They brag about that in the cut line there. She's captured we would never do this now. I mean, maybe there's TMZ or something, but the mainstream, even the Daily News, is sometimes as bad as they can get. I don't think anyone would do this now. So things have gotten a little better. We cross the line sometimes. We still do, but this is one of the worst examples of it. And this is another example of the evil. I'm just dogging my profession up here. The evil that we can do. This is the Sam Sheppard case, and it's an infamous case. Some say it's based, that The Fugitive, both the TV series and the movie with Harrison Ford, were based on this, although the people who did both the movie and TV things say it wasn't based on it. But either way, Sam Sheppard, like Dr. Richard Kimball, was a neurosurgeon, not a heart surgeon like Kimball was, but he was a neurosurgeon, a very successful man, and his wife gets killed. So, you know, he's going through that, and the cops come and they interrogate him, and they clear him as a suspect. He's not suspicious. They don't think it's him. They move on. They're looking for the killer. Then the papers got a hold of it. Why isn't Sam Sheppard in jail? They hammered it and hammered it and hammered it, and this still does go on. We just now passed the 10-year anniversary of the Lacrosse case, in which basically the same thing happened. You had this case, and this woman claimed that these lacrosse players raped her. And the press, in fact, the columnist has come out and apologized for it. She wrote columns, do the right thing and turn yourselves in, and no presumption of innocence, like I was saying that reporters must do. There was none of that. They did it with Richard Jewell in the Atlanta Olympics bombing. He subscribes to Penthouse, and it turned out he didn't do it. He sued and made a lot of money, and he should have. They completely ripped this guy to shreds for nothing. So this Sam Sheppard guy, why isn't he in jail? Why isn't he in jail? Well, like I said, sometimes you have law enforcement and you have political considerations. Well, the police chief serves at the pleasure of the politician mayor, and the prosecutor certainly serves at the politics is what they're interested in. And so, sure enough, they arrested the poor guy and they ran him through a kangaroo court. Talk about a tainted jury. They've got the press saying he pretty much did it for months and months and months. And he got found guilty, and he served 9 years in prison, and he finally got overturned. The Supreme Court called it a circus. There's no way he got a fair trial. And the poor guy, he went from being a successful surgeon, he became a professional wrestler. And nowadays, I guess in some circles you could say that's glamorous, you know, with Hulk Hogan. I'm dating myself. I don't know who the new guys are, but it's a big successful venture now, the WWE. But back then it was considered a degrading thing. You're in these smoky little flea circuses for all intents and purposes. And so this poor guy got railroaded. And then that happened here in Detroit too. A very similar thing, and I get a chance to knock my buddies at the Free Press down here. When the Free Press started, they were a very, very racist newspaper. The Democrats at the time, it's kind of the perception has at least gone the other way, where people say that the Republicans are the one who are racist. That's what they say anyways. But at the time, the Democrats certainly were. They were pro-slavery, and the free press was very, very racist. Well, you had this case, William Faulkner, not the author, he owned a little, Faulkner owned a little tavern in Detroit. And he lived as a white man. I think his grandfather was partially black, but he lived as a white man. He voted at the time when blacks couldn't vote. And so this little girl, oh, what was her name? I have it in my notes, hang on. That would be Mary Brown, 9-year-old girl. Her mom sent her to the post office, and it was a cold day, and she met up with a good friend of hers who was Ellen Hoover. She was a black girl. So they met up as friends, and they walked to the post office together. And it was a freezing cold, so they stopped in Mr. Faulkner's tavern to get warm. And then they came home. Mom said, "Why were you late?" And they said, "Oh, because this guy molested me." And the free press got a hold of it. And like I said, even though he lived as a white man, the Negro Faulkner, oh, it was terrible. If you read some of the stories from the free press, then they just incited things. I mean, same thing. You know, in one case, they actually, during the trial, here's one of the quotes. "The evidence of the Negro's guilt is overwhelming. The only thing to be regretted is there is no law sufficiently severe to punish him as damnable crime, which he has committed so richly merits." Now, this was before he was convicted. They're coming out and just dogging this guy. Again, that would never happen nowadays. Even though the Duke Lacrosse thing, this went way beyond what the Duke Lacrosse. And during the trial, they were almost asking for a riot. It is thought that an excited and indignant mob would have attempted to wreak summary vengeance upon him within the very walls of the courtroom. Sure enough, that's what happened. There was a big riot. And one of the things that came out of this 1863 riot was the Detroit Police Department. There was no police department, municipal police department at the time. And because the response was insufficient, they had to bring in some people from Fort Wayne, and then I believe they brought some in from Ypsilanti or Lansing. But they brought in troops. They didn't have a police. They had watchmen and things like that. So they said, "We need a police department." And one of the good things that came out of this riot was the Detroit Police Department got formed. But I've dogged my friends at the Free Press, so I'm going to give them some props too. I've dogged my position, my profession rather, pretty badly here, and we deserve it. But we also do some good things, and this is one of the recent examples of the good that we do by friends of mine. Jim Schaefer and Mike Elrick broke this story. Doggone it. I don't want to give them guys credit for anything, but no, it was one of the best scoops in Detroit history, where they found out that Kwame lied under oath. So we do some good things. As I said, I had to cover Kwame. I wasn't on the political beat at the time, but obviously crime. So I covered him. And the year anniversary of him getting kicked out of office, he moved down to South Lake, Texas. If you remember, it was in the most ritzy neighborhood in the country, according to Forbes magazine. And I went down there, and it was a ritzy neighborhood. And my editors, if you ever saw the movie Office Space, where, hey, did you get the TPS report memo? It was something like that, and it can be. These editors, again, I'm dogging editors. I hope none of them are watching Livonia Cable, because I'm going to get fired. But but no, I had 5-6 people come up to me before, and they told me on a Wednesday, I'm flying down Friday. It's like, really? He was gone for a year. You just now decided to do a year look at him, so I had to scramble around and get my plane ticket and all that. And 5 people came up to me, "Make sure you talk to his dry cleaner." Somebody important in a meeting said, "Talk to the dry cleaner." Because then another, "You make sure you talk to him." What's the dry cleaner going to tell me? "Yeah, I do his suits, okay." And I found a kilo of Coke in it. What's the guy going to tell me? So, like a good employee, I checked with the dry cleaner. None of them knew him, so... Anyway, I did get a good story out of it, though, because I went, real quick, I'm going to do a side step here. I went to his mansion, and it was a gated community, and there was a gate that's locked here, and the one on the left was open. And it didn't say it was only an exit, so I drove through that one. And I went in, and I knocked on his door, and he didn't open it. He said, what can I do for you? And he knew me. I'd covered him, And he said, "What do you want?" And I said, "Well, I'm here. It's been a year since you've been removed from office, and I'm hoping that you can, give me a few words." He said, "Nah, I ain't got nothing to say." I said, "Well, listen." I said, "Do me a favor. Give me 5 minutes, and then I can leave. Just talk to me for a minute." and then I'm gone. Otherwise, or else, and he cuts me off, he says, or else what? And I said, or else I'm going to have to sit out here because my paper sent me down here to Texas to get a story. I'm going to have to stake out your place, and I'd rather not do that. Give me 5 minutes and I'm gone. I got the story. He says, Kwame's not here. And I knew his voice. It was him. And I said, what do you mean he's not here? He said, Kwame's not here. He's gone. So as it turned out, I got a better story, I think. Tried to make, hay out of nothing. I thought it made there's another saying like that I'll keep. But no, the story I did was this disembodied voice behind this giant oak door. And I went through the dialogue, where he's talking to me, and then Kwame's not here. So I thought that I had turned in the best story I could. And of course, when I got back, my editor was like, well, why didn't you talk to his dry cleaner? I did. He said he does his suits. What's there to do on the dry cleaner? And of course, then when it comes to the big stories, I like that fancy. I was working on that for a long time. I hope you guys appreciate it. I'm going to do that again. Watch this. Boo! That's pretty cool. I didn't know how to do a PowerPoint until I did this. They got all kinds of them, man. You can make diamonds and stuff. No, this is the big one, Watergate. And I can tell you, I get so many calls, people, hey, I got the next Watergate. And I was telling Schaefer that now, since they broke their story, now it's, this one's bigger than Kwame. I've had 20 people since then call me and say, I got something that's even bigger than Kwame. That's the big one. The Watergate is the gold standard when it comes to, that brought down a president, So throughout the history of newspaper reporting, we've done some good and we've done a lot of bad, but I hope we've done more good than bad. Some might argue that. And I just want to end with a little bit of humor. Some of my favorite headlines. This is one of my favorites. Rarely talk to police. I'd like to, if they do talk to police, I think it's going to get on more than page 12. I think that'd be on 1A. We did it too. And I cut my colleagues a little bit of slack there because you're on a deadline. You're going to make mistakes sometime. One time we referred to President Obama as Osama. And people still, people I think were convinced Nolan Finley had something to do with that, that it wasn't a mistake. But it was. We were horrified. And we're scrambling around trying to change it. The good thing about online is you can change information, but once it's in print, you got to print a retraction. As every cop will tell you, the story, the wrong information goes on A1, the retraction goes on page 17Z in a very little, we made a mistake in that blowout headline we had yesterday. So there's one of my favorites. That's poor planning by the newspaper. You'd think somebody would look at the page dummy and say, wait a minute, this isn't. And then there's a few other ones. Federal agents raid a gun shop, find weapons. Diana was alive hours before she died. Stop the presses. And this is one of my favorites. This guy got a prostitute decoy. My sister was a prostitute decoy in Detroit, and she wouldn't tell us where she was either because we were going to drive by. She's got 4 older brothers. We were going to drive by and mess with her. She wouldn't tell us, but she did the decoy thing. And she's a pretty girl. She's trying to figure out how to make herself look sleazy. And she finally figured it out. If she washed her hair with cream rinse and then didn't rinse it out, it would make it look all stringy. And she'd put a cap on, and she was able to. And then one guy stopped. I think it was Christmas Eve, and he was from Birmingham. He stops to pick this girl up, and it's my sister, and she busts him, and he's like, come on, man, my wife's pregnant at home. Well, what are you doing out picking up a hooker for then? It kind of not make you feel. Well, this guy here, he picked up a decoy, and he asked if he wanted some squirrels he'd shot in return for sex, And when she said no, then he said, hey, how about the broken down washing machine I got in the back of my truck? And, the cop laughed and then arrested him, I'm sure. And here's another one, too. Yeah, stabbing disrupts class for anger management. Not a resounding, endorsement of that class, is it? Now, I like stupid criminal stories, and this is the all-time stupidest criminal. This is my favorite story because the guy's such a moron. He's a Klansman, so automatically he's a moron in my book. But this guy is Donald Leroy Evans. He's defending himself, so he murdered a couple people. And during his trial, he wanted to wear his Klan robes. He filed a written motion with the court. He respectedly respectfully request to wear his Klan robes, and they wanted to refer to himself, he wanted the court to refer to him as High Hitler. And the judge says, High Hitler? Why High Hitler? This idiot thought they were saying Hi Hitler instead of Heil Hitler. He thought they were waving Hi Hitler, and I think the motion got denied. So, well, that's all I had to say. I guess I could open it up for some questions, and hey, I'm 10 minutes early. How about that? I thought I was going to go on and on and on, but that's the presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you. Thanks for coming out on such a wonderful evening, and we will. There's other things happening with the History Lives, and I encourage you to visit those as well. Take care, everybody. Thank you.